don't try to sell humanitarian immigration as part of a growth agenda, or don't tell people that this is what will fix our demographic issues and this is what will fix our welfare state challenges. It's very unlikely that this will happen.
That was Tobias Hillenbrandt, a PhD fellow at the United Nations University and Maastricht University. His words point to an uncomfortable reality. In the decade since Germany's historic welcome culture of 2015, the conversation has shifted from optimism to a profound sense of skepticism. But this isn't just a story of pro-migration versus anti-asylum. As we discussed today, German citizens are often more nuanced and mature than the media headlines suggest. We explore why the feeling of a loss of control rather than a lack of empathy is driving today's political landscape. From the shadow of 2015's New Year's Eve's events in Cologne to the refugee fatigue in recent years, we are unpacking what it actually looks like to build an orderly humanitarian system in a polarized age. I'm Alice. This is European Glimpse, and now let's get into the conversation. Welcome to the podcast, dear Tobias. I'm very glad that you joined the session today because you have been working on some quite interesting research regarding attitudes towards refugees in Germany and how they have changed.
Thanks so much, first of all, Alice, for having me here.
I stumbled upon your work when I was reading an article which was published in the online magazine The Conversation. And you've described how the attitudes have changed over the last decade, over the last years. But perhaps in the beginning, we should start in 2015. We should go back to perhaps the most pivotal year when it comes to migration debates. How do you remember 2015?
I was a freshman and then sophomore student, so undergrad student at the University of Mainz in Germany. And indeed, it was a pivotal year in terms of migration, but also just more broadly speaking, I think, for the society. Maybe to put it a bit into context in terms of numbers, before that year, 2015, the largest number of asylum applications in Europe was in the year 1992, which was at the peak of the Balkan crisis, essentially, where there were 700,000 applications filed in Europe. And then in 2015, that number was 1.5 million, so more than twice as much as the previous peak. A special time for me, I mean, I was at a university campus, and as you can imagine, probably with a lot of young social science students, the decision that Angela Merkel took in August 2015 to essentially keep the border open for refugees coming from Hungary at the time was, or found a lot of support. Like, I don't remember really that there were a lot of skeptical or even cautioning voices in my own environment. So I would say the energy was maybe a bit of a mix of, on the one hand, a shock about what was happening, especially in Syria, where the focus of the reporting had been, and then of course a lot of like empathy and then the sense of solidarity that came out of it, at least in the early month of what then became known as the so-called migration crisis. Personally, I was also a bit involved in volunteering activities. I don't want to overemphasize my own role in that, but I was working for some limited period in a refugee residence, essentially in Mainz, working a bit with refugee children, helping them with homework, learning the language, these kind of things. So it was a special period, and looking back from today, it probably also really inspired my own research when I look at my bachelor's thesis topic in political science I was writing, or even obviously my today's research in the PhD. So I think it really also left a mark on my own CV.
It's quite interesting the way you explain it. It differs to a certain degree from my personal memory because in 2015 I had just finished my master's degree, and I did my master's abroad in Denmark and in Poland. And returning after 2 years, my impression was that the mood had already changed because the AFD had appeared. And in late 2014, in Eastern Germany, Pegida movement, self-proclaimed patriots, who were roaming the streets in very threatening looking marches, I would say. That was already a thing, which was not a thing when I left Germany a couple of years earlier. But yes, it is true that there was definitely this wave of solidarity in spite of this shift in mood. And in your view, what positioned Germany or the German society to embrace this welcome culture and Angela Merkel's famous "we can do this" mantra? Why do you think this solidarity and the willingness to help emerged so strongly in 2015? Because it was really a strong thing.
Yeah, it was a strong thing. At the same time, I think it's good that you also highlight already early on, there were some warning signs that, again, in kind of my bubble where I used to live, weren't that present. Perhaps you're also speaking about slightly different time periods. It makes a difference if you speak about November or September of that year, for example. But there is actually there's a working paper, at least by colleagues, I think, from the Center of European Economic Research, which shows how closely linked with the rise of the AFD. They look at just polling numbers, essentially, was linked to the onset of the quote-unquote refugee crisis. So these signs have been there already, and I do think it makes sense to look also at the distinction between what's considered the public opinion and the published opinion. So early on, even a tabloid newspaper like the Bild-Zeitung, the famous, some would say infamous Bild-Zeitung in Germany, was at first, it looked like they were also like joining this really welcome solidarity movement. But I looked up some data from 2015 in preparation also for that podcast now, and what you can see is that indeed the attitude has been overall more positive than it is now. So that is true. The Infratest DIMAP, a German pollster, found that 45% of Germans in September 2015 associated immigration more with advantages for the German society, but 33% also associated with disadvantages. And maybe somewhat similarly, when it comes to being scared of refugee migration, 59% said they were not scared, but there were still 38% who said that it scared them, actually. So I think there was a bit of a divide, also a discrepancy between public opinion and published opinion, which data changed, the reporting changed also quite drastically. Nonetheless, I think you're rightly raising the point that there was a strong wave of solidarity, which is, I think, remarkable, given that hundreds of thousands of people come from different part of the world, looking different, praying to a different god, etc. And I have to speculate a bit what position Germany, or what kind of laid foundation for this to be possible. I think one role played probably also economics. Germany came out better of the previous economic crises, such as the financial crisis and then the euro crisis, than other European countries did, with quite a resilient labor market specifically. By and large, I think in international comparison, Germany is a fairly liberal, post-materialistic society. Not the most one, probably, and we can also discuss whether there has been some backlash also in this regard, but in European comparison, still fairly liberal. And again, speculating a bit, perhaps the historical legacy also plays a bit of a role. The awareness that Germany played such a significant role in the creation of displaced people and refugees in the past, and to see, okay, now we can actually stand on the bright side, on the right side of history. I can imagine that this was also in part something that motivated Germans more than it was the case for other European societies.
Yeah, I think that Angela Merkel as a chancellor played as well a tremendous role. I mean, I remember this particular period in time where Brexit was happening and the election of Donald Trump was around the corner. And that was the era when Angela Merkel was on the cover of Time magazine as leader of the free world. And she was a very composed politician for most of her career, but particularly when it came to accepting refugees from Hungary. I remember her saying something along the lines of, if we can't do this, then this is not my country. Like, this is not my country was such an interesting phrase of hers, which I think as well to a degree persuaded people to believe in the strength of German institutions. But I think we as well have to speak about the unfortunate change in late 2015. And that was definitely the New Year's Eve night, which I believe is still shaping the debate until today. If we look back, there have been very unfortunate harassment cases in Cologne on the night of New Year's Eve. and they were tied to people who were non-German. In the beginning, you didn't know who it exactly was, but there was a very quick mantra of those were non-Germans, potentially refugees, and the narrative of sexual harassment somehow has never disappeared again. How do you see this particular instance and the changes that emerged afterwards?
Yeah, indeed, this was very pivotal moment for the German discussion and discourse, but also the mood in Germany. If we widen the lens a bit across European countries, there was already the incident in November 2015 in Paris, the terror attacks there that also really left a mark, I think, on the overall sentiment in Europe. But again, as you say, for Germany, the New Year Eve events were particularly significant. There's also research, I think, by Maurer from the University of Mainz, shows how the public discourse has changed, like the framing has changed, how there was very little reporting about security threat following or linked with refugee migration, and how this has essentially gone the roof right after New Year's Eve. I might want to put this in a bit of a bigger context in terms of how I think about that and how we can see changes in or shifts in the public sentiment and the public mood when it comes to such large-scale refugee influxes, a bit more generally speaking. I think what we often see is that in the initial weeks or months, there's a focus on what happens pre-arrival, so to speak. So the focus going back to what happened in Syria and Aleppo, and all the pictures that you can see in the media here, the baby boy Alan Kurdi, I think, who was washed off on the shores of Turkish island, if I remember well. So the focus then a lot on the humanitarian plight of the people. It's on why is it that people are leaving, and thankfully this leads to also a lot of empathy and solidarity among host societies. However, over time the attention tends to shift towards what happens post-arrival. Then the issues of immigration, of integration become increasingly visible. In both cases, the focus tends to be on the extremes. So if I go back to the example of Syria, the most horrific atrocities were those that are most widely mediatized. So it's the most extreme forms of humanitarian plight that we see. But then again, when it comes to the immigration and integration challenges and the implications for the host societies, again, the focus is on the most extreme examples oftentimes, like the New Year Eve events, for example, on individual terror attacks. And this is what draws a lot of attention then. And what tends to happen, we see that quite nicely in the data from the Bertelsmann Stiftung, for example, that has like longitudinal data mapping since 2012, mapping essentially how attitudes evolved in Germany, that after such influx, the numbers will go down. Partly maybe because the displacement levels go down, partly because of more restrictive policies, etc. And that's when attitudes recover. So you have this initial peak, essentially, of solidarity. Then the focus shifts towards all the challenges that come with it. And then again, the attention shifts toward also other policy issues. It's just less salient a topic. And this is when attitudes tend to recover.
I believe that we see similar patterns with the Ukrainian refugees to a degree that in the beginning there was this very strong emphasis of what is happening in Ukraine, how horribly bombed the towns and cities are, and it's gradually vanishing out of the public perception. But I would like to stay in the case study of the Syrian refugees arriving to Germany and how things have changed over the last decade. How would you describe the attitudes that we find now? I believe there's a lot more nuance to the story than, well, people are either pro or either against it.
That is true. And this is really also what I'm trying to focus on in my research. Immigration is this big term that encompasses so many different things, so many different forms. For many, many also lump integration into that. But once we try to unpack that a bit, then we find that people make a lot more distinctions and are a lot more nuanced in how they think and feel about a topic than the public discourse sometimes makes us believe. So first, maybe making this distinction between integration and immigration. There is a publication, the so-called Integrationsbarometer, which also regularly collects data on the integration climate in Germany. and they show the data separately for people with a migration background and without migration background. And here, for example, the subgroup with a migration background, so migrants essentially, or people whose parents or grandparents came as migrants, here we don't see actually that there was a drop in how they perceived the integration culture in Germany. It doesn't look like they perceive increased hostility, which is perhaps interesting. Also, some Bertelsmann data suggests that people are still fairly pro-integration, but the change has been more on the side of immigration. But even here, there's a lot of nuance, essentially. When you ask people only, how do you feel about immigration, or do you want immigration regime to be more liberal or more restrictive, people today will overwhelmingly tell you they want it to be more restrictive. However, once you ask specifically for labor migration, or you ask for specific professionals, and that's not only high educated people, that's also like nurses, for example, or maybe plumbers, like these kind of professions, you find still fairly positive attitudes among people. Whereas for refugee immigration, that is actually where the skepticism has risen a lot, and people just tend to think when they hear immigration, that's what they tend to think about. But once you ask a bit more specifically, then you find a lot of nuance there. There's a publication by the Foundation More in Common that shows that actually quite nicely for how many forms or groups of migrants, there's still a lot of support. And then what I try to unpack essentially in my research, and maybe we can come more in detail to that later on, is still that even for refugee immigration, there are differences. The dominant form, of course, is asylum migration today, and that is where people are most negative about. But there are more orderly, more regularized forms of refugee immigration, and for that, still there's a lot of support to keep admitting refugees through these other channels. So, and I believe that first layer of distinction the policymakers have understood, the German government, or like a government like the Italian government, it doesn't look like cracking down on labor migration, but also they often just speak about immigration, but what they actually then mean is mainly refugee migration, but they don't make the distinction between the different forms of refugee migration.
My impression is that there's quite a intuitive knowledge that citizens have about who is kind of meant. Because I'm an immigrant as well, technically. I was not born in Germany, but I don't think that people mean me. I don't think they mean people like me who've grown up in Germany, integrated, working here. My parents are working. Like, I don't think that I am the threat image, so to say. I believe, at least when I'm reading the data and when I'm reading as well, particularly the media discourse, there is a very clear collection of different layers that create a negative image of what the problematic people are. And what I see is there is a cultural layer. We don't speak about European immigration anymore as a threat, or at least a lot less than it was 15, 20 years ago. So nowadays, I would say a lot of people don't care if there's a French person moving to Italy or an Italian person moving to Poland. European migration is that thing. You have the cultural component, non-EU. You have a religious component, Christian, non-Christian. And it seems to me that there is quite a sexist dimension, that male groups are rated a lot less than female groups. And here you probably had the culmination of all of these elements when we're talking about the Syrian asylum seekers in particular. And that to a certain degree created a very complex set of emotions within the population. But I still try to understand, how did the change particularly go in Germany from this, as I said, very, very strong culture of welcoming people, very strong solidarity, to where we're standing now? It is quite obvious that the discourse and the caution that people are expressing is completely different now, speaking in 2026.
That is true, and I think it's also true what you're saying. People have specific ideas or images that come to mind when they hear certain words, such as immigrant. There are a lot of studies that look at, what are the effects of these characteristics, and does it make people more likely to approve someone or someone's asylum application. They say, this person's characteristics, essentially this person's asylum application should be approved, or this person's asylum application should not be. I did stumble over a study that was conducted by the Social Science Center Berlin that looked at different characteristics, but what they found interestingly is that When the reason for a person to move is political persecution, then a lot of the other characteristics that they looked at, such as education, such as religion, such as gender, no longer make any difference, essentially. So what they find is that on average, the data is from 2016, I should say, so perhaps slightly outdated, but I have a sense that it might still be a fairly similar picture today. And acceptance rates were around 94%. There were a lot bigger differences in how people were rating these different profiles, depending on these characteristics, when people were not moving because of political persecution, but because of a bad economic situation. Then suddenly you see that education plays a bigger role. Religion plays a somewhat bigger role. Between gender, it's fairly balanced. Some of the data I'm familiar with is that for labor migration, actually, there's no preference for women, but when it comes to refugee immigration, then there seems to be a preference for women. I think this might also have to do with women being viewed as more vulnerable often, and also perhaps less threatening. You also asked me about, what really brought about these big changes, and perhaps it's interesting to look at, again, this longitudinal data published by the Bertelsmann Stiftung that shows that between 2017 and 2021, there was actually recovery in attitudes. And that was the case even though data from the Maurer media analysis that I mentioned before showed that the discourse became actually increasingly negative at the time. So while the discourse became more negative, attitudes actually recovered. I think this has to do with the fact levels of influxes have gone down at that time. So it was just fewer people who were arriving in the country. And then they go up again. And this has then a lot to do with the next pivotal year, 2022, which was, of course, roughly 1 million Ukrainians moving to Germany, fleeing from the full-scale invasion of Russia. And at the same time, you also see that asylum numbers are picking up at exactly this period again. So for 2020, 2021, during the global pandemic, those numbers were fairly low, and they're picking up again. And how I like to think about opposition toward refugee immigration is that there are essentially three different sources. It can either be a form of fundamental opposition, that people just say, a policy of refugee protection, we just don't want that. We might be willing to help abroad or something, but it's essentially a fundamental opposition. But this seems to be a fairly small minority. Then you have people who say, in principle, we are open for it, but we just think the majority of people who are coming to the country are not deserving. They're not real refugees. There's data from Ipsos poll that shows across the world, across different world regions, it's 61% of people who agree with the statement. In Germany also I think it's the exact same as the global average, like 61% saying most people who come here as refugees are actually not really refugees. And then there's that third source of opposition, which I think has to do with capacities, with the sense that the boat is full, we are overstrained, our administrative capacities, our labor market, our housing market, our schools, the teaching is no longer really effective because so many different languages are spoken in the school classes, etc. Those are people who might say, we think refugee protection is a good thing. We also think the people who are coming here, especially now the Ukrainians, we see there's a war going on. We have no doubt about the legitimacy of their claims, but we just feel exhausted. We feel fatigued, essentially. And that is yet another source of opposition. And I think this really kicked in after 2022, and it then led to the fact that Ukrainians who were seen as overall quite deserving, somewhat preferred over others who came maybe from Syria or Iraq, where the war wasn't at its peak anymore, so deserving levels were lower, especially after the end of 2024 when the Syrian civil war ended. Capacities felt constrained a lot, so people said, okay, then we might have a preference for those with given limited capacities where we feel like they're the most deserving ones. And indeed, the data suggests that before 2022, there was actually not a preference for Ukrainians over Syrian or Afghans or others, but only after 2022, this seems to emerge.
This ties into your research about citizens wanting order, and it's not particularly only about the numbers of people who are coming into the country, but as well how the admission is being perceived. What does an orderly system look to the average citizen? I mean, you have briefly touched upon things like schooling and if the municipalities have enough capacity. I am always wondering to what degree these are things that people are experiencing firsthand, or if this has become a certain narrative that is being shared. But if this is the narrative that is being shared, perhaps there is as well an answer to the narrative in terms of how does order look like?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is quite an interesting question. I think I would answer along the lines of Alexander Kustov, who's one of the probably most influential thinkers on this topic. He has quite an interesting Substack blog post. So anyone who's really interested in the topic can maybe check that out. And what he essentially says is that, of course, there's a lot of messaging going on. There are a lot of narratives out there. But there's a reason that in some countries, narratives around, say, loss of control are just more effective than in others. And specifically, he's contrasting Canada with Sweden, essentially, and says there's a reason that negative messaging, negative narratives have a much easier time to be spread and also to be believed in Sweden than they have in Canada, essentially. Coming back to the research that I'm looking at, so the research question that I was interested in was really to better understand the source of opposition to asylum immigration. If we try to unpack a bit the different forms of immigration, this is where the opposition is really concentrated in the society. And I was curious to find out, okay, what is it actually that is driving this opposition to asylum immigration? It has more to do with it's just too many people who are, from a different culture, who are often low educated, who, again, from different religion, etc. All these things that people just feel like it's too much immigration of this kind of migrants. Or does it more have to do with the way the system is organized with like policy, essentially? And here the most plausible hypothesis is that it has to do with the close link between asylum immigration and irregular immigration, meaning people crossing borders without authorization. This would be the basic definition.
Let me just briefly ask you, to what degree do you believe that there's an overlap in the perception of irregular migration and regular refugees or asylum migration that is happening in an orderly manner?
So in reality, there are very few migration corridors open for people who got displaced to migrate to European countries legally. I think that is actually at the core of the problem, or at least is one of the key issues that we're tackling. So for that reason, most people who want to find protection in one of the European countries, they have to use irregular routes through the Mediterranean or the Eastern Europe, etc. And also, to be clear, that's the point I want to make before there's any misunderstanding. Once an asylum seeker is, say, in Germany, for example, and applies here for asylum, at least up until a point where perhaps the asylum application is declined, they're not irregularly in the country or not illegally in the country. However, once you cross the border as an asylum seeker, it's still a form of irregular migration. I'm not even sure if this is the key concern of people. I think the key concern of people has to do with you don't really know how many people are coming within a year. You don't hand out entry permits and then okay, we have this and that many people, like maybe for some work visas that will come in this year through this and that work visa. There's large degree of uncertainty about the number of people who are arriving, but also just about who are the people. We know that most of asylum seekers who are arriving here don't have valid ID documents. So there's also this uncertainty about who are actually the people who are coming here. And then a third layer of uncertainty or lack of control, as it's perceived, is even if people apply here for asylum and their asylum application is being declined, we know it is very difficult for countries to remove them from the territory unless they leave voluntarily. They are either tolerated and they receive this special status in Germany. But even those who are legally obliged to leave, if they don't want to leave, they usually find loopholes. Now, the current government or the previous one, they have put a lot of effort into that. But, especially if it comes to people who also committed crimes in the country, etc. But still, it's a fairly small minority of those whose application has been declined, who's actually leaving the country afterwards. I think these are really the different aspects when it comes to lack of control that upsets people, and that makes people also just oppose the asylum system as it exists today.
So basically, it's the two elements of, on one hand, it is uncertain who is coming because like the point of entry is still irregular typically, and there's no way to really assess who is this person if they don't carry any passport or ID on them. And the second dimension is that people perhaps view the state as less capable to handle the bad apples. So what we're witnessing in Germany is this big discussion about getting people back to Afghanistan or even to Syria. The debates have already started about that. Now that the situation in Syria has changed, I mean, it's still fragile, but the first demands to send people back to Syria came very quickly after that. I'm viewing it as something that is not so much against the individuals, but something against the weakness of the system. The fact that the European Union, perhaps as a structure, cannot guarantee clear, safe migration patterns. And at the same time, the German state in this case is not capable of reacting in any way if you, for instance, have gangs, organized crime, or whatever related to people from third countries. So those two elements lead to this strong opposition.
Yeah, so I do think you really put your finger on it. You have asked me before about, this change in attitude and public sentiment. I think what we can observe is that in August, September, maybe October 2015, people had a sense of, hey, we can be the good guys here. We can do something good. And this has, I think, transformed into a sense of we are not the good guys anymore, we are the fools. We're being taken advantage of. I mentioned to you before the Ipsos poll, 61% of people think most refugees who come here claiming to be refugees are not refugees. So again, 60% of Germans thinking this way. I'm not saying that this is the case, but this, I think, has really fueled the sense that we were trying to do something good here. We opened our wallets, maybe our doors, etc. But in the end, what we see are, on the one hand, a lot of problems in terms of capacity, but then also that sense of there's a lack of deservingness because we don't know who are the people who are coming in. A clear majority of asylum seekers are men who are maybe between 16 and 40 years of age. So roughly speaking, like young men who are not seen as particularly vulnerable. Again, there are a lot of reasons why it is this group that often migrates here or that is maybe sent from their families to migrate so the others could join in later. And a system that is based on irregular migration, where you have these huge fluctuations, first of all, where you have little control over who is the one who's coming. Is it the people who are really most in need? And then even those who had a chance to apply, who had a chance to appeal at the court, the decision, who still got declined that they still remain in the country, I think really fuels the sense that we're not the good guys anymore. We are being taken advantage of. The system is being exploited. And in that sense, yes, I think it's really an opposition more toward the policies in place, not against the principle of refugee protection. That's what I'm looking at also in my research. There's still a large majority of Germans who back the principle of refugee protection. They're still behind this. We've seen in the integration barometer, people with migration background don't perceive more hostility in the country, but it's really a dissatisfaction with the policies. And maybe a last data point on that, which I found quite impressive. In September 2024, Infratest DIMAP asked people whether Germany needs a turnaround in refugee policies so that fewer people would come into the country, and 77% of Germans agreed with turnaround, quite a strong term, including a relative majority of Green voters, which I think is remarkable, which we probably would not have seen any time in the past.
Yeah, there's definitely something I have noticed over the last years that in terms of the narratives and the perception of Germany, things have changed quite drastically. I was traveling quite a lot through Europe last year. And in several countries, people were saying stuff like, oh, you can't go to Germany anymore. It's so dangerous because this is what you got from taking in so many refugees. And there's this really, really strong sentiment of crime has taken over and a loss of control, even though it's not right. I checked the crime statistics after people approached me with that. And Germany, if you look at dangerous crimes like murder, for instance, or manslaughter, Germany is a lot safer today than in 1990. Of course, one always sees that there are certain groups that are overrepresented in relation to the numbers that they are within the population, are overrepresented in certain crimes. But overall, Germany has not become like this super dangerous place. But this idea or this sentiment of loss of control, it seems to trigger people to such a visceral level that I, at least from my observation, have the impression that we're kind of in a dead-end situation right now in the debate, where you can only talk about policy that either strengthens European rejection patterns or introduces ideas like safe third countries where people can apply. That's definitely something in the debate. In terms of policies, what is your sentiment that people are seeking, like the average citizen, in terms of feeling more order again?
Great. Maybe also just adding briefly on what you said about refugees and crime. First of all, it's indeed that, going back to that media analysis, this is a very strong link that is reported about in the media. So it's not a coincidence that we find that also a lot in the heads of people. You could argue that, you also mentioned that, right? Asylum seekers tend to be overrepresented indeed in crime statistics. And there are also studies now that show a causal link between refugee immigration and crime rates. At the same time, it's very true what you're saying. Germany remains a very safe country. It's safer than it was for most of its past. And it's also true that immigration more generally, here again, we come to those distinctions, is not linked to higher crime rates. So it always depends on the context. It depends on what exactly is it that you're looking for. But for sure, so on the one hand, yes, there is a correlation between asylum seekers and crime rates, but at the same time, Germany remains a very safe country. And there's no justified concern for anyone to say we'll avoid going to Germany because of the large-scale influx of asylum seekers and refugees. It's too dangerous to go there. Hardly anything could be further from the truth. Now, what is it that the Germans are looking for in terms of policies? There is, I think, a very helpful paper in how people think about refugee policies and their preferences that speaks about two different logics. It's a paper by Janet and colleagues from 2021. They essentially say there's a national interest logic, and there's also a humanitarian assistance logic. And people try essentially to bridge the two of them, to find ways to reconcile them. And what they find is that people are willing and remain willing to take in refugees and provide international protection, but they want to add limits and conditions in order to protect the national interests, so to speak. And this is also something that I believe to find in my research when I put this policy proposal to the test that tries, on the one hand, to close irregular migration routes by means of safe third country agreements, while at the same time drastically increasing refugee resettlement. So a very orderly, highly regularized and controlled procedure to bring refugees who are selected based on humanitarian criteria into the country. And what I find there is that indeed there's broad support for this kind of policy. Interestingly, the support levels are not just overall broad, but they're also very consistent across different population segments, including population segments that are typically very polarized on these questions, such as people with or without a university degree, or people from East Germany and West Germany. There are no significant differences. And I do therefore see that as a policy proposal that is seen by the broader public as a way to reconcile the logic of humanitarian assistance with, at the same time, protecting national interests by including additional elements of control. Let me maybe just add that there are other concerns linked to that, especially to the concept of safe third country agreements, which is debated a lot, and there are, they're ethical, they're legal, there are feasibility concerns. But this was not the focus of my research. I really wanted to look at a policy proposal that tried as much as possible to disentangle humanitarian immigration from irregular immigration. And then I find there's very high levels of support for that.
Just out of curiosity, what is your view on the German experience to being applicable to other European countries? I have the hunch, or like the observation, but it's very vibes-based, not research-based, over the last years, that narratives and patterns and political ideas are becoming increasingly similar in Europe. If we're looking at especially right-wing or far right-wing movements in different parties in Europe, no matter if it's Italy or the Netherlands or Germany, like the rhetorics are becoming very, very similar. And I wonder to what degree are the insights of your research, the insights of the German experience, perhaps as well applicable to other nations, because I wonder if they are, or if the political parties are capitalizing on vague sentiments.
Yeah, I share your sense. First of all, for my specific research, I cannot give you an answer that is backed by evidence, simply because my data collections were always confined to Germany. However, there are other studies, of course, that looked at different countries across Europe. For instance, the study I mentioned before by Janet et al. About what asylum policies do Europeans prefer. I would summarize it in this way: the levels of acceptance for, say, refugee migration, they differ across country, but the underlying patterns or preferences for one form or another, for one, say, demographic characteristic over another, for one policy over another, they seem to be fairly similar across different contexts. And I also think, going back to these two logics, that most people don't have an extreme opinion, but that they hold both logics at the same time. So they hold ambivalent attitudes, torn between a sense of moral responsibility on the one hand, but also concerns about what are the implications for my host society. I think this is something that is likely to apply also to many other European contexts. And again, the data that does exist on what kind of policy is preferred, that seems to be fairly homogeneous across different European contexts. Maybe one more thing to add in terms of far-right parties. Indeed, you also see these similar patterns. What happened after 2015 was not only what happened in Germany, but also across many other European contexts. The same after 2022. The rise of the far-right and how this is linked to asylum migration. It's something that is certainly not specific to Germany alone. There are differences, however, across far-right parties, and I'm mentioning that because in my research I speak of a so-called democratic dilemma, which is the idea that you cannot have it both, or there's a trade-off essentially between a fairly liberal immigration system and having stable democratic institutions. Now, you need to qualify that a lot because, first of all, not every kind of immigration creates a backlash. That is what I mentioned before. But also, not every far-right party in Europe is necessarily anti-democratic. And I think there are also differences between those parties. You might still disagree with also far-right parties, and you might passionately disagree with them, even if they don't pose an immediate threat to democratic institutions. I'm more maybe thinking of the country I'm living here in the Netherlands, where the far-right party has been in power as the strongest party also in the government. I'm not an expert on Dutch policies, but there were fair and free elections. I don't think there was a major blow against the rule of law in the country. For the German context, I'd be a lot more cautious, and I think reports from the Domestic Intelligence Service also suggest that, at least in parts, I think in big parts, this part could really pose a threat to democratic institutions.
But just from my understanding, basically the democratic dilemma consists in the assumption or the evidence that the majority of the citizens are not pro a very liberal immigration policy. However, there is an immigration policy in place, and you cannot have, on one hand, this very liberal policy attitude on one hand, and on the other hand, having a democratic principle with the majority of the people or a significant share of the people actually opposing that. Is that the core of it?
So essentially the idea is, if you have large immigration levels, then this will lead to a backlash from the wider population, and this will create a wave on which the far-right parties can ride into the centers of government, essentially. And now there has been quite a bit of work done, and essentially what it suggests is that I think there is a democratic dilemma, but it's much more confined to specific forms of immigration. That's why we mentioned before already, certainly for high-skilled labor immigration, you don't find instances where there has been this pronounced public backlash. It might be some few individuals who oppose that a lot, but it certainly doesn't create this mass movement that leads to a lot of political opposition. And then my idea was to understand, is it refugee immigration per se that leads to this kind of backlash, or is it even there are only actually certain forms of refugee migration, and might other forms of refugee migration be more compatible with, say, public acceptance, more broadly speaking.
All right. So based on all of your research on the empirical evidence that you have gathered, what would be an empirically based political consultation that you would give to Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz as of today, as you observed the debate and the mood in Germany?
Yeah, that is a big question. I think I would try to break it down to the following formula. I think there's a lot more nuance there, as we discussed, than many people might assume intuitively. I think such a strategy probably beats a strategy of policy persuasion. We have discussed there are changes in people's attitudes, attention can shift from one to another. Still, there is quite good evidence that by and large, again, going back to a paper from Alexander Kustov and colleagues in 2021, there is a remarkable stability of immigration attitudes on the individual level. So you will probably not see that someone is a ardent supporter of liberal policies and migration policies today and the opposite in even 5 or 10 years' time, even if there are political and economic shocks that occur in the meantime. And especially now that the policy issue of migration has been so salient, many people probably have made up their mind. I think it's probably not very promising to tell people how they got it all wrong, how they're all driven by misperceptions. I'm not saying there are no misperceptions, there are misperceptions, and they're probably also greater on the anti-migration side than on the pro-migration side, even though there are also misperceptions on the pro-migration side. But I'm not saying they don't exist, but an approach of either you're reprehensible people or you got it all wrong and now let me show you the true facts is probably doomed. Looking at the data more closely, going beyond the headlines and going beyond a survey question of should immigration to Germany be made harder or more liberal, and really trying to understand what is that people think of when you ask the question and what are they open for, and you'll find that they're still open for a lot of forms of migration essentially, and trying to exploit these nuances is probably a good way forward. And if I may maybe add one general piece of advice, don't try to sell humanitarian immigration as part of a growth agenda, or don't tell people that this is what will fix our demographic issues and this is what will fix our welfare state challenges. It's very unlikely that this will happen. Immigration itself can be a very powerful tool. Humanitarian migration, probably not. There are good evidence that the net fiscal contributions of asylum seekers and refugees are quite negative. However, just be frank with the people, I would say, and say, refugee policies is not about what we want to achieve. It's not an instrumental tool, so to speak. I would say it's about who we want to be as a society. And I think there's no need to hide that. I think just be open about that, be transparent to the people, and it will probably be the better way forward.
Yeah, I agree. I would prefer a more mature and adult style of political communication, which takes citizens seriously as adults and nuanced people. But on the other hand, I always wonder if in our day and age, with people being so exhausted by the vast amount of media and bait and all of the stupid videos floating around on TikTok and whatnot, if people are even willing to listen anymore. I mean, in the political communication, the game of political narratives, as well, the citizens' attitudes play quite a role. And I don't know where we're going to be in a couple of years down the road.
I think it's a great point that you're making here. And I would link that to different forms of polarization that we see. And there are publications by the Institute Miedem in Dresden, in Germany, that look at these different forms of polarization. And what they find is that indeed people find the topic of immigration more divisive than any other policy issues that they've been testing. They don't find a lot of ideological polarization, at least not how they measure it, but what they find is that more than any other topic, there's so-called affective polarization on the topic, which means that people, when they talk about migration with others and they disagree, they take it quite personally, I would put it. So they don't only reject the other person's opinion, but they tend to reject the other person outright. And this is, of course, very harmful to the political discourse. But this is something that is not only found on the far right, there you see high levels of affective polarization, but you also see it a lot on among people, who vote for more pro-migration parties, that they are also very likely to take these disagreements very personally and maybe cut ties to family members, to friends, if they disagree on those questions. And I think this is something we can maybe all be working on, that, I understand there can be red lines, but for my research, and I'm asking people also about, like, what is it, including AFD voters that I have in my sample, right? What is it why do you oppose asylum migration to Germany? In most cases, the answer is not just, I don't like immigration, or I don't like immigrants, or I don't like foreigners. It's, in most cases, not all, but in most cases, there is a lot more reasoning, a lot more nuance again. And I would encourage everyone to engage in these discussions, including with the people that we passionately disagree with on this topic.
That's a very good concluding point, I would say. I personally have started last year to host dinners where I invite just people to talk, because we're as well kind of losing third spaces where we can have as well political debates, but in a friendly manner where it's not combative. Tobias, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and all of the research.
I commend you for the initiative, and I hope maybe some of our listeners might follow your example. And yeah, thank you so much, Alice. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of European Glimpse. This is a passion project of mine, and it would make me very happy if you subscribed or shared this episode with a friend. Now I'm curious to find a new guest. Are you a journalist, a scholar, a student, or perhaps an avid observer of society? If you live in a European country, as well outside of the European Union, reach out to me or recommend somebody I should speak to. I would as well love to hear your feedback on this podcast, as I'm always trying to improve, and my email is europeanglimpse@gmail.com. Take care.